Welcome to our channel. What if a forgotten Tudor princess, armed not with a sword but with a philosopher's mind, ascended the throne? This is the story of Queen Isabella, the monarch who almost was, a tale of reason, revolution, and the England that might have been. Isabella, the Tudor queen who rewrote England's destiny. Part 1. The Unforeseen Heir. In the bleak midwinter of 1517, a silence fell over Greenwich Palace, a heavy, expectant hush that even the whipping winds off the Thames could not disturb. Queen Catherine of Aragon, now past her 30th year, was once again confined for childbirth, and the kingdom held its breath. For 8 long years, the Tudor throne had awaited its ultimate security, a living, breathing prince. The king, Henry VIII, a titan of a man whose vibrant energy seemed to fill every corner of his court, paced the outer chambers, his moods shifting like the January sky. He had a daughter, the beloved Princess Mary, but in a world where a queen's primary duty was to provide a male heir to continue the dynasty, a daughter was but a pretty prelude to the real performance. The memory of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle that had bloodied the fields of England for decades, was still fresh, and the Tudor claim to the throne, forged in battle by Henry's father, remained a source of quiet anxiety. A stable succession required son, an undisputed heir to prevent the wolves, the rival claimants with their own whispers of royal blood, from descending into chaos upon the king's death. The royal nursery had been a place of heartbreaking brevity. A prince, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, had been born and celebrated with magnificent tournaments only to die within weeks, and several other pregnancies had ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Thus, the atmosphere at court was thick with a mixture of fervent prayer and cynical political calculation. Great lords and ambitious families saw in the queen's confinement not just a national event, but an opportunity. A new prince would mean new positions of power in the royal household, new influence, a reordering of the constellations of favor that glittered around the king. Conversely, another failure would deepen the shadows around the queen and embolden those who whispered that her marriage to her brother's widow was cursed. In the queen's chambers, the air was dense with the scent of chamomile and sweat, the murmurs of Latin prayers spoken by her ladies-in-waiting, and the stern pronouncements of the royal physicians. These men, draped in funereal black, spoke of humors and celestial alignments, their medical knowledge a fragile shield against the grim realities of childbirth in the 16th century. The ladies surrounding the queen were more than mere servants. They were the eyes and ears of their powerful families, astute political players who understood that their proximity to the monarch gave them a unique, albeit informal, influence. They managed the flow of information, gauged the queen's moods, and subtly jockeyed for position, knowing that the birth of an heir would solidify their own standing. Late on the second day of labor, a cry was heard, thin but clear. It was not, however, the robust shout the kingdom longed for. The physicians, faces grim, soon emerged to make their report to the anxious king. The queen had been delivered of a child, but it was another daughter. And she was small, worryingly so, her hold on life seemingly as tenuous as the winter sunlight that briefly touched the palace windows. The news spread through the court like a contagion, disappointment curdling the air. Henry, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief, dismissed the doctors with a wave of his hand and retreated into his private chambers, the sounds of his fury muffled by thick tapestries. For the great lords, the birth was a non-event, another delay in the great matter of the succession. For the queen's enemies, it was a confirmation of her inadequacy. The infant princess, named Isabella after her maternal grandmother, was deemed so frail she was not expected to survive the night. She was baptized in a hurried, private ceremony, a stark contrast to the grand public christenings of her siblings. She was an afterthought, a footnote in the grand, masculine narrative of dynastic survival. In the royal nursery, meticulously scrubbed and guarded against plague and illness, the infant Isabella was placed under the care of a wet nurse and a small staff, separate from her older sister Mary. While Princess Mary, as the recognized heir presumptive, had a household befitting her station, Isabella's was modest, almost an admission of her perceived irrelevance. Yet in this quiet, overlooked corner of the palace, something unexpected happened. Against all odds, the child survived. She clung to life with a fierce tenacity that belied her fragile frame. As days turned into weeks, her cries grew stronger, her gaze more focused. The ladies assigned to her nursery, initially seeing their role as a political dead end, began to whisper of the child's quiet resilience. They noted her watchful, intelligent eyes that seemed to follow their movements, a seriousness that was unusual in an infant. While the great drama of the court continued to revolve around the king's desperate quest for a son and the queen's fading hopes, this second princess began to grow, almost in secret. She was not presented at court with the same fanfare as her sister. Foreign ambassadors barely noted her existence. Her value on the European marriage market was considered negligible. She was a spare, and a seemingly weak one at that. This very neglect, however, became a strange kind of blessing. Unburdened by the crushing expectations placed upon her sister, Isabella's world was the nursery, a space governed by women. Here, away from the rigid formalities and political machinations of the main court, she was exposed to a different kind of education. Her governess, a gentlewoman of minor nobility with a surprising love for letters, read to her not just from the Bible, but from smuggled copies of humanist texts and old English romances. While Mary's education was meticulously planned to mold her into a suitable queen consort for a foreign prince, emphasizing piety, obedience, and languages, Isabella's was unstructured, allowed to follow the currents of her own burgeoning curiosity. She learned her letters quickly, showing a precocious aptitude for languages and a fascination with the maps that her tutors brought to illustrate her history lessons. She was a ghost in the palace, a quiet, observant child who learned to navigate the corridors unseen, listening to the conversations of guards and courtiers, piecing together the complex web of power that defined her world. The king rarely saw her. To him, she was a living reminder of his failure, another daughter in a kingdom that cried out for a son. Queen Catherine, consumed by her own grief and her increasingly desperate attempts to hold onto her husband's affections, showed her a distant, sorrowful kindness. It was her sister Mary who offered the most consistent affection, though it was tinged with the pity of a secure heir for a superfluous sibling. This unforeseen heir, born in disappointment and raised in obscurity, was a variable that no one in the intricate arithmetic of Tudor politics had thought to calculate. They saw a frail girl, a political irrelevance, and looked away, their eyes fixed on the larger prize of a male heir. They did not see the keen intellect being quietly sharpened, the resilient spirit being forged in the shadows, or the profound understanding of power being absorbed by the little princess who was supposed to be nothing. Part 2. The Greenwich Academy. By the time Princess Isabella turned 12, the political landscape of England had shifted dramatically. Her mother, Queen Catherine, was now a shadow at court, her marriage to the king effectively over as he pursued the captivating Anne Boleyn and sought an annulment from Rome, a move that was sending shockwaves through Christendom. Princess Mary, fiercely loyal to her mother and the Catholic faith, had been declared illegitimate and cast out of the line of succession, her household dissolved, and her spirit hardened by grief and defiance. Amidst this turmoil, Isabella remained the forgotten princess, a quiet and studious girl who, through a peculiar twist of fate, had attracted the notice of one of the most brilliant and enigmatic minds of the age, Dr. John Dee. Dee, a man whose intellect straddled the worlds of rigorous mathematics and esoteric mysticism, was a polymath in the truest Renaissance tradition. He was an astronomer, a geographer, an antiquarian, and an astrologer, a trusted advisor to nobles, and increasingly to the marginalized princess. He had first been introduced to Isabella's small household by one of her tutors, a Cambridge scholar, who recognized in the young princess an intellectual curiosity that was both profound and insatiable. Dee, whose own library at Mortlake was becoming one of the greatest in England, saw in Isabella not a pawn in the dynastic game, but mind of rare potential. While the formal education for noble women, even royal ones, was typically limited to languages, music, needlework, and piety, skills designed to create an accomplished and obedient wife for a foreign prince, Dee proposed a radical new curriculum for Isabella, one grounded in the humanist ideals then sweeping across Europe. With the tacit and largely indifferent permission of the king, who was consumed by his great matter, a unique institution began to take shape within a quiet wing of Greenwich Palace, what Isabella and her small circle of tutors privately called the Greenwich Academy. This was no formal school, but rather a dedicated space for intellectual inquiry, a sanctuary of learning far removed from the poisonous intrigues of the court. At its heart was a library, curated by Dee himself, filled with texts that would have been considered scandalous, if not outright heretical, elsewhere in the palace. Alongside the expected Bibles and classical texts of Ovid and Virgil were treatises on Copernican theory, which posited a sun-centered universe, challenging centuries of established doctrine. There were Arabic texts on optics and algebra, translations of Plato that spoke of ideal forms and philosopher kings, and Machiavelli's controversial new work on the nature of power. The Academy's curriculum was breathtakingly ambitious. Isabella rose before dawn not for prayer, but for lessons in astronomy with Dee, learning to chart the movements of the stars and planets using astrolabes and quadrants. In an age where astronomy and astrology were inextricably linked, these lessons were as much about predicting the future and understanding divine will as they were about celestial mechanics. Dee taught her to cast horoscopes not as a simple parlor trick, but as a complex mathematical and philosophical exercise in understanding the interconnectedness of the cosmos and human destiny. Her mornings were devoted to the rigorous study of mathematics and natural philosophy. She learned Euclidean geometry, not just as an abstract discipline, but as a practical tool for navigation and architecture, subjects Dee argued were essential for a ruler of a potential maritime empire, a term he himself had coined. He brought in artisans and engineers to demonstrate the workings of new inventions like the wheel-lock musket and the printing press, insisting that a modern ruler must understand the technologies that were reshaping the world. Her afternoons were spent on languages and rhetoric, but with a significant departure from the norm. While her sister Mary had been taught languages for the purpose of marriage alliances, Isabella learned them as tools of statecraft and intellectual exploration. She became fluent not only in French, Spanish, and Italian, but also in Greek and Latin, allowing her to read classical texts in their original forms. Her tutor in rhetoric, a disciple of Erasmus, trained her not in the art of polite conversation, but in the Ciceronian principles of persuasive argument, teaching her how to construct logical proofs, appeal to emotion, and dismantle the arguments of her opponents, skills almost unheard of for a woman of her time. The Greenwich Academy was more than just a place of academic learning. It was a crucible for a new kind of royal identity. Dee and his fellow tutors, all proponents of the new humanism, believed that a ruler's authority should derive not just from divine right, but from intellectual and moral virtue. They instilled in Isabella the Platonic ideal of the philosopher ruler, one who governed with wisdom, reason, and a deep understanding of the world. In this secluded environment, Isabella's worldview was formed. She learned to see the world not as a fixed, divinely ordered hierarchy, but as a complex system of forces, political, natural, and celestial, that could be understood and perhaps even influenced through knowledge and reason. She saw the religious schism tearing her family and her country apart not merely as a matter of faith, but as a political struggle rooted in dynastic anxiety and competing claims to authority. She read the histories of great queens of the past, not as cautionary tales of female weakness, but as case studies in the exercise of power. The court remained largely oblivious to this intellectual experiment. To the few who noticed, Isabella was merely the quiet, bookish princess, a stark contrast to her passionate and defiant sister, Mary, and the dazzling, sharp-tongued and bullion who now wore her mother's crown. They did not see the young woman who could debate points of theology with scholars, calculate the trajectory of a cannonball, and read Machiavelli in the original Italian. They did not understand that in the quiet halls of Greenwich, a new kind of tutor was being forged, one whose claim to power would be based not just on blood, but on a formidable and disciplined intellect, an heir being prepared not just to marry a king, but to be a monarch in her own right. Part 3. A Coronation of Whispers. The air inside Westminster Abbey was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of beeswax, old stone, and the collective, unvoiced anxieties of the most powerful men in England. 1. 2. It was the autumn of 1547, and the great pestilence had scythed through the royal family with terrifying impartiality, taking the robust King Henry, his fragile son Edward, and his elder daughter Mary within a single, fever-ridden season. Now all that stood between the Tudor dynasty and extinction was Isabella, the scholar princess, the forgotten heir, walking slowly towards a coronation chair that had sat at the center of English power for centuries. One every footstep, muffled by the thick carpet strewn with herbs, echoed in a silence that was more damning than any open protest. This was not a coronation of joyful acclamation. It was a ceremony held under duress, a political necessity born of unprecedented disaster, and the whispers followed her down the long nave like restless ghosts. To her right, arrayed in the dark velvets and heavy furs that bespoke their ancient lineage, were the old guard of the nobility, men like the formidable Duke of Norfolk, his face a granite mask of disapproval. They were the great landowners, the martial aristocracy, whose power was rooted in feudal tradition and unwavering Catholic faith. Their whispers were of sacrilege and instability. They saw not a rightful monarch, but a girl of 20, a creature of books and strange philosophies, known to spend more time with the eccentric mystic John Dee than with her ladies-in-waiting. They questioned her legitimacy, not of birth, but of spirit. How could a woman, and a scholar at that, lead an army? How could she command the respect of warlike kings and emperors? They saw her humanist education not as a strength, but as a dangerous affectation, a flirtation with ideas that questioned the divine, unchanging order of the world they ruled. Their loyalty was conditional, a brittle thing offered for the sake of the realm's stability, but they were watching, waiting for the first sign of weakness, the first proof that a woman on the throne was, as they had always believed, an aberration against God and nature. Across the aisle, the faces of the reformers were a study in conflicted hope. Men who had risen under her father's break with Rome, who had championed the New English Bible and the dismantling of the monasteries, now watched Isabella with a keen, calculating gaze. Their whispers were of doctrine and influence. They had been terrified by the prospect of the fiercely Catholic Mary's accession, and Isabella's survival was, to them, a mark of divine providence. Yet, she was an unnerving savior. She had never publicly declared for their cause. Her piety expressed more through Platonic dialogues than Protestant sermons. They heard rumors that her library contained the works of Erasmus, who sought to reform the church from within, but also of Copernicus, who sought to reorder the very heavens. Was she a true believer who would complete the Reformation? Or was she a lukewarm intellectual who might seek a dangerous compromise, a third way that satisfied no one? They whispered of placing their own men in her household, of guiding her unsteady hand, of ensuring that this unexpected opportunity to secure their faith was not squandered by a queen who might value reason above revelation. In the shadows of a far transept, the imperial ambassador, his black Spanish attire a stark slash against the abbey's gray stone, observed the proceedings with cold, reptilian stillness. His dispatches to the Emperor Charles V were already written in his mind. His whispers were of marriage and restoration. An unmarried queen was a weakness, an empty space on the political map that could be filled. He saw an opportunity to bring England back into the fold of the universal church through strategic marriage to a Habsburg prince. He noted her composure, her erect bearing, the unsettling intelligence in her eyes. This was not a frightened girl, but a woman of formidable self-possession. He whispered warnings to his master that she would not be easily manipulated, that her mind, honed in Dee's strange academy, might be heretical in ways that were more subtle, and therefore more dangerous, than simple Protestantism. As Isabella knelt before the Archbishop of Canterbury, she was acutely aware of all of it. For she could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the pressure of their competing ambitions. She had spent a lifetime in the quiet margins, observing power, studying its mechanics in the abstract pages of history and philosophy. Now, she was its focal point, the central gear in the terrifyingly complex machine of the state. As the holy oil, cold and viscous, touched her forehead, hands, and chest during the anointing, she did not think of divine sanction. Instead, she thought of a passage from Machiavelli on the necessity of appearing pious while being prepared to act otherwise, and of a lesson from Dee on the gravitational forces that kept the planets in their orbits, an elegant, unseen power that held a complex system in balance. She understood that the crown the archbishop now held aloft was more than a symbol of her right to rule. It was a target. When the heavy, cold weight of St. Edward's crown was finally lowered onto her head, the sensation was not one of triumph, but of profound and crushing isolation. 5. 6. The cry of Vivat Regina Isabella from the archbishop was taken up by the assembled lords, a grudging, ragged shout that lacked true conviction. When the trumpets blared, the bells of the abbey began to toll, but for Isabella, the sound that mattered most was the one that the music could not entirely drown out, the persistent, rustling, serpentine whisper of a kingdom that did not yet believe in its queen. Part 4. The Act of Supremacy and Soul. In the first weeks of her reign, Queen Isabella convened her privy council not in the grand presence chamber, but in the austere, book-lined silence of her private library at Whitehall, a deliberate choice that unsettled every man present. The room itself was a statement of intent, dominated not by a throne but by a large oak table strewn with celestial charts and a brass armillary sphere that gleamed in the thin winter light. The matter at hand was the single, cancerous issue that had consumed English politics for 2 decades: religion. The lords, both the old Catholic nobility and the new Protestant gentry, had come prepared for a familiar battle, expecting the new queen to declare her allegiance and for the bloody pendulum to swing once more. Instead, Isabella, flanked not by guards but by the unnervingly serene Dr. D, placed a single sheaf of papers on the table and outlined a proposal so radical, so alien to the established principles of European statecraft, that it left the most powerful men in the kingdom momentarily speechless. She called it the Act of Supremacy and Soul. The first part was a deft political necessity, a reaffirmation of her father's core principle. The monarch of England was the supreme governor of the Church of England, answerable to no foreign potentate. This was the steel in her proposition, the part that secured the nation's sovereignty and protected the property and positions of the new landed gentry who had profited from the dissolution of the monasteries. She argued this point with cool, secular logic, speaking of England as a body politic that could not function with two heads, one in London, one in Rome. This much the reformers could grudgingly accept, and the old guard knew they had little power to oppose. It was the second part of the act, the and soul of the title, that struck them like a physical blow. With a quiet but unshakable authority, Isabella declared that the crown's supremacy extended only to the temporal, material, and legal aspects of the Church. It governed the institution, its lands, its laws, its hierarchy. It did not, she stated, presume to govern the inner relationship between an individual and God. The act explicitly forbade any inquiry into a subject's private beliefs. As long as a subject remained loyal to the crown and abided by the laws of the realm, their form of worship in the privacy of their own home or in quiet congregation was their own affair. The state would not, she announced, make windows into men's souls. She was not proposing a compromise creed, a middle way to appease both sides. She was proposing to remove the matter of private faith from the purview of the state altogether. She argued, using phrases that sounded more like Plato than St. Paul, that a faith enforced by threat of fire or forfeiture was no faith at all, but merely an act of political obedience. True piety, she contended, could not be legislated, and attempting to do so only bred hypocrisy and rebellion, poisoning the well of national unity. A subject's duty to the sovereign was their loyalty in this world. Their duty to God was a sacred, personal covenant to be settled in the next. The Duke of Norfolk was the first to find his voice, his face purple with outrage. This was not governance, he thundered, but an invitation to anarchy and heresy. To tolerate error was to court God's wrath upon the entire nation. It was a dereliction of the monarch's sacred duty as defender of the faith to protect the flock from the wolves of false doctrine. The Protestant Bishop of Winchester, his voice trembling with a different kind of fury, saw it as a betrayal. He accused her of fostering a serpent's nest of popery, allowing the Mass to be mumbled in secret chapels and the authority of the Pope to be whispered in confessionals. Where was the call for a truly reformed, godly nation? This act, he declared, was a lukewarm abomination, a work of atheism dressed in the robes of philosophy. Isabella listened to their tirades without interruption, her fingers resting lightly on the armillary sphere. When they were done, she did not respond with scripture or fury. She responded with questions. To Norfolk, she asked if his tenants were more loyal when they feared his bailiff or when they respected his justice. To the bishop, she asked if the apostles had converted the Roman Empire with the sword or with the word. She spoke of the kingdom as a great vessel and of the religious factions as winds from opposing directions that threatened to tear the sails and break the mast. Her duty as captain was not to sail into one storm to escape the other, but to find a course that harnessed both winds, however contrary, to move the ship forward. The act of supremacy and soul passed through a stunned and divided parliament not because of popular acclaim, but because neither faction could countenance the victory of the other, and Isabella's radical proposal was, for all its strangeness, a form of mutual disarmament. It created a cold peace, a framework for coexistence that satisfied no one's spiritual zeal but appealed to a war-weary nation's yearning for stability. It was an act of profound political genius, and to many, profound spiritual indifference, a queen's decree that the soul of England was a private matter, a revolution not of doctrine, but of definition. Part 5. The Northern Uprising. The ink on the Act of Supremacy and soul was barely dry before the North began to burn. In the rugged, windswept counties beyond the River Trent, loyalty was a fiercer, more personal thing, given not to an abstract crown in distant London, but to the great feudal lords, the Percys, the Nevilles, the Deckers, who had ruled those lands for centuries, and whose faith was as ancient and unyielding as the stony hills. To them, Isabella's act was not a compromise, but a profanity, a London-bred piece of godless sophistry that abandoned the nation's soul to the devil. It was here, in the autumn of 1548, that the old Earl of Northumberland, a man whose piety was matched only by his contempt for the new intellectualism of the court, raised the sacred banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. It was a call to arms that resonated through every stone church and fortified Pelée tower in the region. Thousands flocked to his cause, resentful knights who felt their martial prowess devalued by a bookish queen, devout commoners who believed they were marching in a holy crusade, and priests who saw this as a final, desperate battle for the soul of England. They called their movement the Pilgrimage of Grace, a revival of the name used in a similar rising against Isabella's father, framing it as a righteous mission to march on London, depose the philosopher queen, and restore the one true faith. When the news reached Whitehall, the Privy Council was seized by a collective, visceral fear. This was the nightmare they had all foreseen, a full-scale civil war, a bloody echo of the Wars of the Roses. Lord Weston, the grizzled Lord Marshal of England, slammed his gauntlet fist on the council table and demanded an immediate and overwhelming military response. The plan was simple, brutal, and time-honored. Raise the royal levies, march north, and hang every 10th man in every rebellious village as a lesson in obedience. To the council's astonishment, Queen Isabella refused. While her lord spoke of armies and treason, she spoke of the uprising as a failure of persuasion. She declared that to send an army to slaughter her own subjects was to admit that her governance was based on fear, not consent, an admission she would not make. She saw the rebellion not as a simple challenge to her power, but as a direct challenge to her philosophy of rule, and she chose to meet it on her own terms. Her counter-strategy was a 3-pronged assault that baffled her military commanders. First, she authorized Lord Weston to raise the army, but his orders were not to attack. He was to establish a fortified line along the Trent, a defensive cordon that would prevent the rebellion from spreading south. He was to blockade the roads and offer amnesty to any man who deserted the rebel cause, but he was strictly forbidden from seeking a pitched battle. This containment policy was designed to buy her most precious commodity, time. Second, she unleashed a weapon the northern lords could not counter, the printing press. From a bank of presses set up in London, a flood of pamphlets and royal proclamations, written not in complex Latin but in plain, direct English, began to pour into the towns and villages on the edge of the rebel heartlands. They did not condemn the rebels as heretics, but addressed their grievances with reasoned arguments. They explained that the Queen's Act was not an attack on faith, but a guarantee of peace, a promise that no man would again be burned for the contents of his soul. Crucially, the pamphlets also reframed the narrative. They portrayed the northern earls not as champions of God, but as feudal opportunists, deliberately stoking the fires of war to regain their own diminishing power and drag the kingdom back into an era of bloodshed and instability, all while the Queen worked to secure a future of peace and prosperity. The third prong of her strategy was economic. She declared a complete embargo on the north, using the Royal Navy to blockade its ports and the army along the Trent to halt all overland trade. The vast wool exports that were the lifeblood of the northern economy ceased. Shipments of grain from the south were stopped. She aimed to make the rebellion not just spiritually questionable, but economically ruinous, squeezing the purses of the very merchants and yeomen the earls relied upon for support. As winter set in, the strategy began to bite. The great rebel host, camped in the field, was a hungry, idle, and increasingly fractious body. Their zeal was being chilled by the cold and eroded by the Queen's relentless propaganda, which was smuggled into their camps by royal agents. The economic blockade caused widespread hardship, and the promised glories of a holy war gave way to the grim reality of impending starvation. Then Isabella made her final audacious move. She announced she was traveling not to London's secure tower, but north to the city of York, which lay just south of Weston's defensive line. Against the frantic protests of her council, who saw it as an insane risk, she entered the northern capital with only a small ceremonial guard. She did not come to wage war, but to hold court. For 2 weeks, she sat in the great hall of the king's manor, accessible to any who wished to petition her. She listened to the grievances of weavers whose trade had been halted, of mayors whose towns were struggling, of wives whose husbands had marched north. To all, she projected an image of calm reason and profound concern, a monarch who preferred a petition to a pitched battle. The effect was devastating to the rebellion. While the Earl of Northumberland offered a glorious death for God, the Queen was in York offering peace, pardon, and the chance of renewed trade. The Pilgrimage of Grace, starved of supplies, ideologically outmaneuvered, and abandoned by a populace that now saw more hope in the Queen's reason than in the Earl's faith, simply dissolved. Men drifted away from the rebel camps and returned to their homes. The great lords were left isolated and powerless. Lord Weston's army finally crossed the Trent not to the sound of cannons, but to the silence of a surrendered cause. The Northern Uprising was over, defeated not by the sword, but by a masterful campaign of ideas, economics, and political theater that solidified Isabella's throne and announced the arrival of a startlingly new kind of power in the realm. Part 6. The Company of Sea Dragons. With the Northern Uprising pacified and the realm held in a tense but stable peace, Queen Isabella turned her gaze outward from the rolling hills of her kingdom to the vast, shimmering expanse of the sea. Her council, now accustomed to her unconventional methods, was summoned not to the staid chambers of Whitehall, but to a cavernous, salt-scoured loft in the royal dockyards at Deptford. The air was alive with the smells of hot pitch, sawdust, and the damp chill of the Thames, and the room was dominated by a colossal map of the world, painstakingly pieced together from the latest Portuguese and Spanish charts, its vast empty spaces marked only with the ominous legend, Terra Incognita. Here, surrounded by the skeletal ribs of half-built ships, Isabella, with Dr. D at her side, unveiled her next great project, one that aimed to redefine England's place in the world. She presented a charter not for a royal navy, which the crown could not afford, nor for a simple trading venture, which she deemed too limited in scope. She proposed the creation of a new, quasi-governmental entity, the Governor and Company of Merchants of England trading into the far reaches, known more colloquially and evocatively as the Company of Sea Dragons. It was a revolutionary concept, a hybrid organization designed to weave together the Crown's ambition, the merchant's capital, and the scholar's knowledge into a single, formidable instrument of national policy. At its core, the company had a tripartite mission that reflected the Queen's unique worldview. The first and most public objective was commerce. Isabella pointed to the map, her finger tracing the routes controlled by Spain and Portugal, a stranglehold that funneled the wealth of the New World and the Indies exclusively into the coffers of her rivals. The Sea Dragons, she declared, would not challenge this monopoly head-on. Instead, they would seek the unseen paths, the passages of mind, as she put it. They would probe the icy northern seas for a fabled northwest passage to Cathay. They would push east into the Baltic to establish trade with the Muscovy Company, and they would chart the treacherous coast of Africa not for gold and slaves, but for new markets and alliances. The goal was to circumvent the Iberian powers, creating a new global economic network with London at its center. The second pillar of the company was knowledge. This was the element that bore the unmistakable stamp of John Dee and the Greenwich Academy. Every major expedition was to carry not just a captain and a crew, but a new kind of officer, a scholar navigant. These men, hand-picked and trained by Dee himself, were to be masters of the new sciences of celestial navigation, cartography, and mathematics. But their duties went far beyond merely piloting the ship. They were commanded to be the kingdom's eyes and ears. They were to create charts of unparalleled accuracy, to measure magnetic declination, to document winds and currents, to catalog new species of plants and animals, and to compile dictionaries of newly encountered languages. The ship's logs were to be more than records of voyages. They were to be scientific treatises, a torrent of raw data that would flow back to Greenwich to be analyzed, cataloged, and transformed into a comprehensive, state-owned repository of global intelligence. Isabella argued that true, lasting power came not from hoarding gold, but from accumulating knowledge. Gold could be spent, but knowledge, of a safe harbor, of a favorable wind, of a political division in a foreign court, was an asset that grew with use. The final mission was that of deterrence. The company's ships were to be built to a new design, overseen by the Queen's master shipwrights. They were to be race-built galleons, sleeker, faster, and more weatherly than the lumbering carracks of Spain. Crucially, they were to be heavily armed with the finest bronze cannons in Europe, cast in the foundries of Sussex. In peacetime, these cannons would protect the company's trade from pirates and rivals. But the charter contained a critical clause. In times of national emergency, the entire fleet, with its seasoned crews and advanced ships, would be nationalized, instantly becoming the Royal Navy. It was a shadow fleet, a navy in waiting, funded by private profit rather than royal taxes. This ingenious scheme provided for national security without the crippling expense of a permanent standing military, perfectly aligning the commercial interests of the merchant class with the strategic interests of the crown. The initial reception from the London merchants was skeptical. They were practical men, wary of this talk of scholar navigants and celestial charts. But Isabella's offer was too shrewd to refuse. The crown would provide the royal charter, granting a monopoly on all trade in newly discovered territories, and it would fund the construction of the first 3 ships. In return, the merchants would buy shares, financing the voyages and sharing in the immense potential profits. She was not asking for their taxes. She was inviting them to become partners in England's future prosperity and power. The first expedition of the Sea Dragons, 3 ships with the resonant names Intellect, Courage, and Fortune, was dispatched not to the warm, treasure-laden waters of the Caribbean, but to the brutal, ice-choked seas north of Muscovy. While the courts of Europe mocked the Ice Queen and her futile quest, the voyage returned 2 years later, having lost 1 ship but having established a lucrative trade route for English wool and fur with the court of Ivan the Terrible. More importantly, it returned with charts, astronomical data, and a wealth of information that was immediately put to use planning future ventures. The company of Sea Dragons was born, a unique fusion of commerce, science, and statecraft that set England on a new course, charting a future built not on conquest alone, but on a relentless and calculated pursuit of global knowledge. Part 7. The Franco-Imperial Gambit. The fragile peace of Isabella's England, a quiet island of reason in a sea of European religious fanaticism, was not seen as a marvel by the great continental powers, but as a profound and intolerable threat. To the Valois King of France and the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, whose domains and treasuries were strained by their long and bitter rivalry, the existence of a prosperous, stable, and heretical England under a queen who ruled by philosophical decree was a dangerous anomaly that could infect their own restless populations with ideas of intellectual and spiritual liberty. In the ornate, tapestry-hung chambers of Paris and Toledo, a rare and cynical consensus was reached: the philosopher queen had to be removed. Thus was born the Franco-Imperial Gambit, a deadly 2-headed serpent of a plan designed to strike at England from without and within simultaneously, exploiting the very divisions Isabella had sought to transcend. The first head of the serpent was the overt threat of invasion. From the ports of Normandy, a French fleet began to assemble, and the tramp of soldiers echoed through the streets of Calais, while in the Spanish-held Netherlands, the Duke of Alva's feared tercios, the most formidable infantry in Europe, were put on high alert. The combined naval power of the 2 greatest Catholic monarchies was being prepared to crush the upstart island nation, a show of overwhelming force intended to incite panic, drain the English treasury, and force Isabella to divide her small land forces to watch 2 coastlines at once. But it was the second, more venomous head of the serpent that was intended to deliver the fatal bite. The Gambit's true genius lay in its coordinated subversion, a plan to turn Isabella's carefully balanced kingdom against itself. French gold and whispered promises of support flowed into the northern counties, seeking to reignite the embers of the Pilgrimage of Grace by encouraging a new rising among the still disaffected Catholic nobility, with a distant Yorkist cousin presented as a pliable and properly pious replacement for the heretic queen. Simultaneously, the imperial ambassador in London, a man of reptilian cunning, was secretly fanning the flames at the other end of the spectrum, stoking the paranoia of the most radical Protestant reformers, convincing them that Isabella's policy of toleration was a path to damnation, and that a swift, godly coup to place a more zealous Protestant on the throne was the only way to save England's soul. The goal was to plunge England into a multi-front civil war, a chaos of extremes that would shatter the nation's fragile unity and make a foreign intervention to restore order and true religion seem like a blessed relief. Yet the architects of this grand design had critically misjudged their opponent. They believed they were moving against a conventional monarch who would respond with conventional means. They did not understand that Isabella's greatest weapon was not her army or her navy, but the vast, intricate web of information she had been meticulously weaving since the first day of her reign. The scholar navigants of the Sea Dragon Company, whose true mission was as much intelligence gathering as it was trade, had sent back coded reports from the dockyards of Antwerp and Le Havre. Dr. D's network of correspondence, a quiet fraternity of astronomers and alchemists scattered across the courts of Europe, relayed the political whispers and troop movements they overheard. Before the first French ship had raised its anchor, Isabella knew the full scope of the gambit. In a Privy Council meeting that buzzed with fear and calls for immediate, desperate military action, the Queen was a portrait of unnerving calm. She did not order a panic mobilization. Instead, she began her countermove, a game of exquisite political chess. She summoned both the French and imperial ambassadors to separate audiences, treating them with a disarming cordiality that set them both on edge. To the Frenchmen, she casually mentioned her admiration for the new Italian fortification techniques being used to strengthen the English coastal defenses, and then, with a thoughtful air, inquired whether his master was truly confident that the Spanish, once landed on English soil, would ever be content to leave. To the imperial ambassador, she spoke of the logistical difficulties of a sea-borne invasion and wondered aloud if the famously ambitious Valois king could truly be trusted not to make a separate peace in exchange for Calais and a free hand in Flanders. She was planting seeds of doubt, using the deep, abiding mistrust between the two powers as her primary weapon. At the same time, she moved to neutralize the internal threat. She did not arrest the northern lords, which would have made them martyrs. Instead, she invited them to a great council in London to advise her on the national emergency, an invitation that was in fact a command, bringing them to the capital where they could be watched and separated from their power base. For the Protestant plotters, she reserved a different fate. Her agents, having infiltrated their circles, allowed the plot to mature until the moment they made their move, at which point they were swiftly and publicly arrested, their connections to the Spanish ambassador laid bare for all to see. The masterstroke, however, was public. Standing before the assembled London militias at Greenwich, she delivered a speech that would be printed and distributed across the kingdom within days. She did not speak of the Pope or of Luther. She spoke of England. She held up a Spanish gold coin and a French livre, describing them as the price for which foreign kings sought to buy English souls and English chains. She declared that she would not be the queen of a Catholic England or a Protestant England, but of England itself, an island of free minds, beholden to no foreign priest or prince. She was activating her new political consensus, calling not on fractured religious loyalties, but on a shared, secular patriotism. The gambit collapsed with astonishing speed. The northern lords, isolated in London, saw the unified public response and the exposure of the Protestant plot and quietly swore new oaths of fealty. The radical reformers were discredited, their foreign puppet master exposed. In the Channel, a newly activated Sea Dragon fleet of fast, heavily armed galleons, a navy the continental powers did not even know existed, materialized and began to harry their supply lines. Faced with a united, prepared England, and now deeply suspicious of each other's ultimate intentions, France and the Empire hesitated. The invasion was postponed, then abandoned. The Franco-Imperial Gambit, the master plan to extinguish the English experiment, had failed. It had not been defeated by force of arms, but dismantled by superior intelligence, political cunning, and the quiet power of a revolutionary idea, a nation defined not by its creed, but by its sovereignty. Part 8. The Great Survey of the Realm. Having secured her kingdom from the machinations of foreign kings, Queen Isabella turned the same piercing, analytical gaze that had dismantled the Franco-Imperial Gambit inward upon the very soil and soul of England itself. She understood that her victory had been born of superior information. She knew her enemies' plans while they knew her only as a caricature. Now, she confronted the unsettling truth that she knew as little about the true state of her own kingdom as her enemies had. Her authority rested on a collection of ancient charters, incomplete tax rolls, and the often self-serving reports of local lords. The realm was, in essence, a terra incognita, as vast and unmapped as the territories her sea dragons sought overseas. In the relative quiet that followed the failed invasion, she therefore launched the most ambitious, and to many, the most alarming project of her reign, the Great Survey of the Realm. This was to be no mere census for the purpose of taxation, no simple repeat of the conqueror's doomsday book which had been designed to catalog the spoils of a conquered land. Isabella envisioned something far more profound, a complete, empirical inventory of the nation's entire capacity, a mirror, as she described it to her council, in which the kingdom could see its own true face for the first time. The project was to be a monumental act of state-sponsored knowledge gathering, the domestic application of the same philosophy that guided her scholar navigants across the world's oceans. A new body of men, the Royal Commissioners of the Survey, was created to carry out this colossal task. They were not drawn from the great nobility, whose local interests the Queen saw as a corrupting influence, but from the burgeoning class of university-educated men, the graduates of her own Greenwich Academy's intellectual milieu. They were cartographers, mathematicians, engineers, and humanists, trained in standardized methods of observation and recording, equipped with the finest surveying instruments, astrolabes, quadrants, and newly designed waywisers for measuring distance. They were, in effect, a new kind of civil servant, their loyalty given not to a local earl, but to the abstract ideal of empirical truth and to the crown that sponsored its discovery. For 2 years, these commissioners traveled the length and breadth of the kingdom, parish by parish, hundred by hundred, their work methodical and relentless. Their mandate was breathtaking in its scope. They were not merely counting heads, they were mapping the very anatomy of England. They surveyed roads, measuring their width and assessing their condition in summer mud and winter frost. They charted rivers, noting which were navigable and where the currents were treacherous. They documented every bridge, assessing whether it was of stone or wood and how many arches it possessed. In the fields, they did not just record ownership but took soil samples, noted the types of crops grown, and estimated yields. They walked the forests and counted the great oaks suitable for shipbuilding. In the towns and villages, their inquiry was even more intrusive. They recorded the number of looms in a weaver's cottage, the output of a tinner's mine, the number of cattle at a market. Most radically, they were tasked with assessing the human capital of the realm. They recorded not just names and titles, but skills. Was a man a master mason, a shipwright, a blacksmith? Could the village priest read Latin and Greek, or merely stumble through the English service? They were creating a detailed map of the kingdom's intellectual and practical resources. The reaction was one of profound and widespread suspicion. The great lords saw the survey for exactly what it was, a fundamental challenge to their power. For centuries, their authority had rested on being the sole source of information about their own domains. They alone knew the full extent of their wealth and the number of men they could raise. The survey bypassed them entirely, creating a direct channel of information between the people and the crown, rendering the king's knowledge of a duchy greater than that of the duke himself. They whispered that this was a prelude to crushing new taxes, a way for the queen to bleed the kingdom dry with mathematical precision. To counter this, Isabella instructed her commissioners to proceed with a careful and deliberate transparency. In every village, they were to begin by explaining their purpose not as an act of intrusion, but as a quest for understanding. The queen cannot mend a road she does not know is broken, they would say, nor can she foster the weaver's trade if she does not know where the weavers live. The vast torrent of data flowed back not to the royal treasury, but to a new institution established at Greenwich, the Office of the Royal Survey, under the direction of Dr. D. Here, in a series of long, brightly lit halls, the raw information was collated, cross-referenced, and transformed. It became a collection of magnificent maps, the first truly accurate atlas of the entire kingdom. It became volumes of statistical tables showing the distribution of wealth, resources, and skills. It became, in essence, the first comprehensive, data-driven model of a nation-state. The Great Survey of the realm fundamentally and permanently altered the nature of governance in England. It replaced anecdote with evidence, tradition with information. When the council debated the establishment of a new foundry, the queen could now consult a map showing the precise location of iron ore deposits, the proximity of timber for fuel, and the condition of the roads for transport. When a famine threatened, she knew exactly where the grain surpluses were and how to get them to the areas in need. The survey was her greatest weapon, a tool of such power that it allowed her to govern with a foresight and precision that no other monarch in Europe could match. It was the ultimate expression of her philosophy. That knowledge was not merely an adjunct to power, but was power's truest and most potent form. Part 9. A Parliament of Common Minds. The Great Survey had provided Queen Isabella with a perfect, intricate map of her kingdom's body. Now she intended to give that body a voice. For centuries, the English Parliament had been a creature of two parts: the House of Lords, a chamber of hereditary peers and bishops who were the realm's great spiritual and temporal landowners, and the House of Commons, a gathering of knights and burgesses who, while technically commoners, were overwhelmingly drawn from the same landed gentry class, their power rooted in the acres they owned and the tenants who worked them. It was a parliament of property, a forum where the crown negotiated with the owners of England, primarily on the subject of raising taxes to fund wars. But Isabella's survey had revealed a new England, a nation whose vitality pulsed not just from the great estates, but from the bustling workshops of London, the smoky foundries of Weald, and the crowded quays of Bristol. The men who generated this new wealth, the merchants, the master craftsmen, the engineers, were politically invisible, their expertise untapped, their loyalty unsecured. To Isabella, governing England without the counsel of these men was like trying to navigate a ship by consulting only the passengers in the grand cabin while ignoring the pilot, the navigator, and the shipwright who built the vessel. In the spring of 1553, she summoned Parliament and laid before it a proposal that was, in its own quiet way, as revolutionary as her act of supremacy and soul. She did not seek to abolish the existing structure, a move that would have invited certain rebellion. Instead, she proposed to expand the very definition of representation in the House of Commons through what she called the Charter of Vocations. Under this charter, the right to send representatives to Parliament would be extended beyond the traditional county seats and a handful of charter boroughs. New seats would be created, allocated not by geography or population, but by economic and intellectual function. The Company of Sea Dragons would be granted a representative to speak on matters of overseas trade. The Worshipful Company of Mercers, the most powerful of London's guilds, would have a member to advise on the vital wool trade. The Shipwrights of Deptford, the Tin Miners of Cornwall, the Iron Masters of Sussex, each of these crucial vocations would be granted the right to elect a representative, a man chosen not for his lineage, but for his mastery of a specific and vital craft. The proposal was met with a wave of apoplectic fury from the traditional powers. The great lords in the upper house saw it as an abomination, an elevation of base commerce and greasy mechanical arts to the level of statecraft. The Earl of Surrey declared that taking counsel from a shopkeeper on how to run a kingdom was like asking a plowman to write a sonnet. For the landed gentry in the Commons, it was a direct threat to their own status. They were the natural leaders of their communities, their authority sanctioned by God and generations of land ownership. The idea of sitting alongside a man who smelled of coal, smoke, or fish, a man whose hands were calloused from labor, was an insult to the natural order of society. They argued that these new men would have no grasp of the great matters of war and diplomacy, that their vision would be limited to the narrow concerns of their own trades. Isabella's response was a masterful exercise in political maneuvering. She did not argue in the abstract language of rights or equality. She argued in the cold, hard language of the survey. When the gentry of Kent complained that the new representative for the Iron Masters would not understand the needs of the county, she produced a ledger from the survey demonstrating that the Wealden iron industry now generated more direct revenue for the Crown than all the agricultural estates in Shire combined. To deny such an interest a voice, she argued, was not just unjust, it was fiscally irresponsible. To the lords who scoffed at the idea of a merchant advising on foreign policy, she presented a captured Spanish ledger, brought back by a sea dragon captain, that detailed the flow of silver from a new world, and then invited the representative of the Goldsmiths Company to explain its likely impact on the price of bullion in London and the Crown's ability to hire mercenaries. She was replacing their arguments from tradition with her own arguments from fact. She did not stop there. She created a powerful new coalition of interests, binding these newly enfranchised groups directly to her. She granted their guilds new royal charters and offered their industries favorable tax considerations, making it clear that their newfound political power and their future prosperity were inextricably linked to their support for the Crown. The Charter of Vocations was eventually forced through a bitterly divided Parliament, its passage secured by the Crown's immense influence and the undeniable logic of the Queen's data-driven arguments. The first session of this new Parliament was a scene of unprecedented social friction. Men in the fine silks of the gentry sat awkwardly beside men in the sober, dark wool of the merchant class. Debates on agricultural subsidies were now followed by intensely technical discussions on the standardization of barrel staves or the proper dredging of the Thames, led by men who had spent their lives working with their hands and their wits. The old elites were initially contemptuous, but they soon found themselves at a distinct disadvantage. When a bill was proposed to fund a new harbor, the lord of the local manor could speak of his family's ancient rights, but the shipwright from Deptford could speak with unassailable authority on the exact depth of the channel required, the best source of seasoned oak for the piers, and the estimated cost in both coin and labor. Slowly, grudgingly, the nature of power in the chamber began to shift. Competence began to rival lineage. Expertise became a new form of authority. Isabella had not created a democracy, but she had forged a new kind of political body. A parliament of common minds, an assembly that reflected the true, complex, and dynamic nature of the kingdom she ruled. She had broken the monopoly of the landed class on political power and created a government that could see, understand, and legislate for the entire nation, not just one part of it. Part 10. The Compass and the Crucible. The return of the Sea Dragon ship venture from the edge of the known world was not the triumph the company's investors had hoped for. While she limped back to Deptford with a hold half full of strange spices and silks from a newly established trading post in the Levant, her captain's log was a litany of harrowing failures that spoke to a fundamental crisis in the nation's ambitions. The log detailed weeks spent lost in the Atlantic fogs, the ship's compass spinning erratically, a victim of the mysterious magnetic variation that Dr. D had theorized but that no sailor yet understood how to predict. It described cannonballs of inconsistent quality, some shattering on impact, others flying wide of their mark, a testament to the unreliable rule-of-thumb methods of the Sussex foundries. The ship's hull, built of the finest English oak, had been ravaged by a previously unknown sea worm in the warmer southern waters, a biological threat that the master shipwrights had no answer for. To Queen Isabella, reviewing these reports alongside parallel data streams from the Great Survey that revealed declining agricultural yields in certain shires and inconsistent ore quality from Cornish mines, the message was profoundly clear. England's great engine of commerce and statecraft, which she had so carefully constructed, was reaching the limits of its power. Its gears were grinding against the hard, unyielding realities of the physical world. The nation's knowledge was broad, but was not deep. It was a collection of inherited crafts and practical traditions, insufficient for the global stage she envisioned. The kingdom needed a new kind of knowledge, a systematic, experimental, and relentlessly practical understanding of the material world itself. Her solution, born of this crisis, was the establishment of an institution that had no precedent in Europe, the Royal College for the Advancement of Natural Philosophy, known more simply as the Crucible. She chartered it not as a university to rival Oxford or Cambridge, with their ancient devotion to theology and the classics, but as a workshop of the realm, a place where the theoretical and the practical would be fused under immense pressure to produce results. Its home was a dissolved Augustinian monastery on the outskirts of London, a deliberate and symbolic choice, its cloisters, chapels, and scriptoriums repurposed into laboratories, furnaces, and drafting rooms. The first fellows of the Crucible were not bewigged dons, but the very men who represented the new seats in her Parliament of Common Minds. She brought together Dr. D as the college's director to provide the theoretical framework of mathematics and astronomy, the master shipwright from Deptford, tasked with solving the riddle of the sea worm, the chief iron master of the Weald, commanded to produce a cannon that would not fail, and a controversial but brilliant alchemist named Thomas Charnock, whose secret knowledge of metallurgy and distillation was now brought into the service of the state. Their first great project was the problem of the unseen lines, a direct response to the venture's ordeal. Under D's guidance, a team of mathematicians and instrument makers began the painstaking work of creating a global map of magnetic variation. They dispatched smaller, faster ships on dedicated voyages with the sole purpose of taking thousands of exacting measurements, their scholar navigants using newly designed instruments to chart this invisible force that governed the compass. The result, years in the making, was the Atlas Caelestis et Marinus, the Celestial and Maritime Atlas, a state secret of immense value that gave English captains an almost supernatural ability to know their true position on the Earth's oceans. Simultaneously, in the smoky long gallery that had once been the monastery's refectory, Charnock and the Iron Masters tackled the problem of the cannons. Applying the alchemist's precise techniques of controlled heating, purification, and the introduction of minute quantities of other elements, manganese from the West Country, charcoal from specific types of wood, they moved beyond the blacksmith's art. They began a process of systematic experimentation, casting hundreds of small test pieces, meticulously recording the results, and in doing so, they developed a new process for creating a form of cast iron that was stronger, more uniform, and more reliable than any in Europe. The Queen's cannons, as they came to be known, became a legend, another key to the kingdom's growing power. The Crucible's work touched every aspect of the realm. Botanists, using data from the survey, conducted experiments in crop rotation and soil enrichment, creating new agricultural techniques that slowly began to reverse the decline in yields. Anatomists, granted the controversial right to perform dissections, produced detailed charts of the human body that revolutionized the practice of surgery. The Crucible became the intellectual heart of the state, an engine of innovation that was directly plugged into the nation's needs. Its fellows were tasked with solving the practical problems of the kingdom, and their successes translated directly into greater prosperity and greater security. It was the ultimate expression of Isabella's philosophy, a state driven by inquiry, a kingdom whose greatest resource was not its land or its gold, but its organized, institutionalized, and relentless pursuit of knowledge. Part 11. The Weavers' Revolution. For 500 years, the wealth of England had been built on the back of a sheep. The export of raw, unprocessed wool to the great weaving cities of Flanders had been the unshakable foundation of the kingdom's economy. English kings had fought wars over it, and the Lord Chancellor of England sat upon the woolsack in Parliament as a perpetual symbol of this singular dependence. It was a lucrative but fundamentally subservient trade. England provided the raw material, but the skilled artisans of Bruges and Ghent performed the alchemy of turning fleece into fine cloth, reaping the lion's share of the profit and prestige. Queen Isabella, studying the detailed economic flows mapped by her Great Survey, saw this not as a strength, but as a critical vulnerability, a leak in the kingdom's hull, as she termed it. The nation's prosperity was precariously balanced on a single commodity, subject to the political whims of the Spanish governors in the Netherlands and the demands of the powerful Flemish guilds. The answer, she knew, was not simply to sell more wool, but to capture the value of the final product, to transform England from a nation of shepherds into a nation of master weavers. The challenge was formidable. The Flemish had a near monopoly on the complex skills, trade secrets, and specialized looms required to produce the fine, brightly dyed cloths that dominated the European market. English cloth was, by contrast, a coarse, heavy, and drab affair, suitable for peasants but not for princes. A frontal assault on this entrenched industry seemed impossible. So Isabella opted for a strategy of subtle subversion, a plan that weaponized her most radical policy, the act of supremacy and soul, to launch an industrial revolution. Her agents, a new class of commercial attaches operating under the cover of the Company of Sea Dragons, began to move quietly through the weaving cities of the Spanish Netherlands. They did not seek to steal industrial secrets or bribe master craftsmen. Instead, they carried a simple message, delivered in the hushed tones of clandestine prayer meetings and in the back rooms of Protestant printing shops. They spoke of a kingdom across the sea where a man's faith was his own, where he could work and worship without fear of the Duke of Alva's feared Council of Troubles, the infamous Council of Blood, that was systematically persecuting Protestants and other dissenters. They described a land ruled by a philosopher queen who offered not just sanctuary, but opportunity. The message was timed to perfection. The Netherlands were convulsed by religious strife. Skilled weavers, many of whom belonged to Calvinist or other Reformed congregations, lived in daily terror of arrest and execution. Isabella's offer was a lifeline. She did not just offer asylum. She offered a new life, a complete, state-sponsored package of resettlement. Under the new drapery scheme, she promised any skilled weaver and his family free passage to England, a house and a workshop in the designated settlement town of Norwich, a 7-year exemption from all royal taxes, and most crucially, the guaranteed freedom to practice their faith without interference. It was an act of profound economic and demographic warfare, disguised as an act of religious compassion. The first wave of refugees was a trickle, then a steady stream, then a flood. Whole congregations, led by their pastors, packed their disassembled looms and their precious dye recipes and made the short sea crossing to England. The city of Norwich, a sleepy provincial wool town, was transformed. Its quiet streets now echoed with the clatter of 1,000 new looms and the unfamiliar accents of French and Flemish. These were not just weavers, they were the masters of the new draperies, lightweight, versatile, and brightly colored fabrics like serges and bombasines that were far better suited to the new fashions of the Renaissance than the heavy English broadcloths. Isabella's government did not leave their success to chance. The Crucible was tasked with supporting the new industry. Its chemists worked with the immigrant dyers to analyze and replicate the properties of continental plants, finding English equivalents for woad and madder, and even developing new, more vibrant colors. Its engineers studied the Flemish looms, making small but significant improvements to their efficiency. The Queen's new Parliament of Common Minds passed laws standardizing the quality of the new fabrics, creating a royal seal that quickly became a guarantee of excellence. The effect on the English economy was transformative. Within a decade, the export of raw wool had dwindled, replaced by the far more profitable export of finished cloth. London and Norwich became the new centers of the European textile industry, and the wealth that had once flowed to Antwerp now poured into English coffers. The Weavers' Revolution did more than just enrich the kingdom. It fundamentally altered its social fabric. It created a new, powerful, and fiercely loyal class of urban artisans who owed their lives and their prosperity directly to the Queen's policy of religious toleration. It demonstrated, in the most tangible way imaginable, that her abstract philosophical principles could be forged into a devastatingly effective instrument of economic power. She had not conquered Flanders with an army. She had hollowed out its greatest industry with an idea. The woolsack in Parliament remained, but it was now a symbol not of dependence, but of a triumphant and self-sufficient past. Part 12. The London Meridian Project. The spectacular success of the weaver's revolution pour a new and volatile river of life and coin into the ancient, cramped arteries of London. The city, whose medieval layout was a tangled knot of narrow lanes and timber-framed houses, began to swell, its population expanding at a rate that terrified the city fathers. The influx of Flemish and French artisans, combined with a flood of English workers drawn by the booming economy, turned London into a glorious, chaotic, and dangerously unstable metropolis. The Great Survey's meticulous maps of the capital, when presented to the Queen, depicted not a proud center of a rational kingdom, but a sprawling, organic monster on the verge of consuming itself. The Thames, the city's great highway, was also its open sewer, choked with industrial effluent and human waste. The risk of plague, a constant, terrifying shadow, grew with every new crowded tenement. The ancient wooden houses, leaning against each other for support, were a tinderbox awaiting a single stray spark to ignite a catastrophic inferno. To Isabella, this was an unacceptable paradox. She had forged a modern state built on principles of order, data, and foresight, yet its heart was a chaotic relic of a bygone age. The city was an offense to her philosophy, a system spiraling towards a predictable and preventable collapse. She resolved that London itself must be brought into alignment with the new England she was building, that the city must be remade not by chance, but by design. She summoned a new kind of royal commission, not of lords but of practitioners, engineers and anatomists from the Crucible, the master shipwright of Deptford, the representatives of the masons and carpenters guilds from her new parliament, and Dr. D. In a vast chamber at Greenwich, dominated by the largest and most detailed map of London ever created, she unveiled the London Meridian Project. The project was a breathtakingly audacious plan to impose a new, rational order on the city, to redesign its very metabolism. At its heart was a powerful act of intellectual recentering. Dr. D, working with the Crucible's astronomers, was commanded to establish a prime meridian, a line of zero longitude that would pass directly through their observatory at Greenwich. This was more than a navigational tool for her sea captains. It was to be the foundational axis for the city's redevelopment. London would be the first city on Earth to be mapped and organized along a grid of pure mathematical reason. The plan itself was a direct application of the Crucible's problem-solving ethos to the challenges of urban life. To combat the threat of plague, the Commission proposed a radical public health initiative inspired by rediscovered Roman engineering. A great aqueduct, the New River, was to be dug, bringing millions of gallons of fresh, clean water from the springs of Hertfordshire into a series of reservoirs and public conduits throughout the city. This would be paired with the construction of a comprehensive network of brick-lined sewers to carry waste away, a project of a scale unseen in Europe since the fall of Rome. To defeat the threat of fire, the project mandated a new building code. All new construction within the city walls was to be of brick or stone, with slate or tile roofs replacing flammable thatch. Key thoroughfares were to be widened, creating fire breaks to prevent a blaze from sweeping across the city. The most controversial part of the plan was the reorganization of commerce. The tangled mess of workshops and markets would be rationalized into specialized districts. A new Grand Royal Exchange, funded jointly by the Crown and the city's merchants, would be built as a central hub for finance and trade. This rationalization, however, required the demolition of entire neighborhoods, the seizure of ancient properties, and the complete redrawing of parish and property lines that had existed for centuries. The resistance was immediate and fierce. The City of London Corporation, the powerful body that governed the city, saw the Meridian Project as a tyrannical assault on its ancient, chartered liberties. Small landowners and guilds protested that the Crown was trying to destroy their ancestral homes and livelihoods. They saw the cool, mathematical lines on the Queen's maps not as progress, but as the erasure of their history. Isabella, ever the strategist, did not meet this resistance with force. She deployed a campaign of persuasion and co-option. She began not with a mass demolition, but with a single model ward built on former monastic lands that had reverted to the crown, showcasing the benefits of the new style of building, cleaner, safer, and more spacious. She then brought the great livery companies, the powerful merchant guilds, into the project as partners, not as victims. She offered them the lead in redeveloping their own districts, providing them with the engineering expertise of the Crucible and favorable loans from the royal treasury. She convinced them that a more efficient, healthier city was a more profitable one. The London Meridian project was not the work of a single year or even a single decade. It was a slow, arduous, multi-generational transformation. But it had begun. It was the ultimate expression of Isabella's reign, the application of systematic, evidence-based reason to the greatest challenge of all, not just governing a people, but reshaping the physical world in which they lived. She was building a new capital for a new kind of nation, a city founded on the compass and the crucible, a London designed for the future. Part 13. The Emissaries of the Sunstone. The silver of the New World was a poison flooding the veins of Europe. It poured from the ravaged mountains of Potosi into the treasuries of the Habsburg King of Spain, funding the vast armies that enforced Catholic orthodoxy and threatened the precarious balance of power on the continent. Every Spanish galleon that crossed the Atlantic was another nail in the coffin of the Protestant cause, another brick in the wall of England's strategic isolation. Queen Isabella, studying the Crucible's meticulous analyses of European inflation and the flow of bullion, understood this with chilling clarity. To attack the Spanish fleet was mere piracy, a temporary annoyance. To truly challenge Spain, she had to attack the source. She had to understand, and perhaps undermine, the very foundation of its American empire. But her approach, as always, would be utterly unconventional. She had no interest in a crude race for gold or a bloody conquest of her own. She sought not to replicate the Spanish model, but to dissect it, to find its weaknesses, and to cultivate a power that the Spanish, in their avarice, could not even comprehend. Thus was born the most secret and audacious venture of her reign, the Sunstone Project. It was not a mission of conquest, but of deep espionage, cultural, scientific, and political. Its goal was to make direct clandestine contact with the remnants of the great indigenous empires, the Aztec and the Inca, to bypass the Spanish colonial authorities entirely, and to initiate a direct exchange of knowledge. The agents for this mission, known only as the emissaries, were not soldiers or sea dogs. They were the finest products of her New England. The leader was a man named Thomas Harriot, a brilliant astronomer and linguist from the Crucible who had spent 2 years mastering the Aztec language of Nahuatl from captured Spanish codices and a rescued native informant. He was accompanied by a botanist-physician, a man who had studied the new anatomy and who was tasked with cataloging the unique flora of the Americas, and a cartographer-geologist whose job was to map the true geography and mineral wealth that lay beyond the Spanish-controlled territories. Their ship, the Observer, was a small, swift pinnace designed for speed and stealth, not battle. Its hold contained no weapons for conquest. Instead, it carried a cargo of carefully chosen gifts, each one a message. There was a small, portable printing press with Nahuatl type, a symbol of the power to preserve and disseminate one's own culture. There was a set of finely ground optical lenses and a brass telescope, an offering of a new way to see the heavens. And there were steel plows and seed drills, tools of agricultural efficiency, a demonstration of a power that created rather than destroyed. After a perilous 2-year voyage, navigating with the aid of D's secret magnetic charts, the Observer made a secret landing on a remote stretch of the Mexican coast. From there, Harriet and his small team, guided by native sympathizers, began a long and dangerous journey inland into the high mountain valleys where the Aztec nobility and priesthood had retreated, preserving what they could of their shattered civilization. The first contact was tense. The Aztecs, their world destroyed by the Spanish, were deeply suspicious of all white-skinned men. But Harriet did not approach them as a conqueror. He came as a scholar, speaking their language, showing deference to their customs, and presenting his gifts not as tribute, but as an exchange between equals. The turning point came when he used the telescope to show the Aztec priests the moons of Jupiter, a sight that confirmed and expanded upon their own highly advanced astronomical observations. In that shared moment of intellectual discovery, a fragile trust was born. For a year, the emissaries lived among the Aztecs, and what they learned would change the course of English history. They did not find vast stores of gold. They found something far more valuable: The botanist discovered the bark of a tree the natives called quinaquina, a substance that could treat the deadly malarial fevers that plagued Europe, a medical breakthrough of incalculable worth. He documented the properties of the potato and maize, humble crops that could grow in poor English soil, and provide a bulwark against the famines that periodically swept the kingdom. The geologist mapped vast, untapped silver deposits in regions the Spanish had yet to penetrate. But it was Harriot's discovery that was the true prize. He learned the intricate politics of the broken empire, the simmering resentments, the prophecies of the Spaniards' eventual fall. He learned of the vast network of roads, the tribute systems, the precise weaknesses in the Spanish administrative machine. He compiled a secret history of the conquest, a catalog of Spanish atrocities and native grievances. When the emissaries finally made their perilous return journey, they brought back to Isabella not the plunder of an empire, but the blueprint for its dismantling. They brought back the means to revolutionize English agriculture and medicine. Most importantly, they brought back the intelligence and the cultural understanding necessary to begin a long, patient game of fostering rebellion, of forging alliances, of positioning England not as the next conqueror of the New World, but as the unlikely ally of its indigenous peoples. The Sunstone Project had yielded its treasure, a strategic advantage so profound that it would shape the global balance of power for the next century. Part 14. A Garden of Earthly Delights. The true treasure of the Sunstone Project arrived in England not in guarded chests of bullion, but in a series of humble, earth-filled terracotta pots and canvas sacks carried ashore at Deptford under the personal supervision of the Crucible's botanists. To the dock workers and merchants who watched, it was a bafflingly unimpressive sight. A few straggly, bitterbark saplings, some lumpy, dirt-caked tubers that looked like misshapen rocks, and a bag of hard, bright yellow kernels. Yet, in these unassuming organic specimens, Queen Isabella saw the foundation for a new kind of English power, a power rooted not in the conquest of foreign peoples, but in the systematic mastery of the natural world for the betterment of her own. She envisioned a kingdom where the specter of famine, that ancient, cyclical beast that had haunted the lives of the common folk for centuries, would be slain forever, not by prayer or providence, but by the application of reason to the soil. Her vision found its physical form on a sprawling tract of royal land at Richmond, a parcel of meadows and woodlands that she commanded be transformed into an institution unlike any other in Europe, the Royal Gardens for Experimental Husbandry. This was to be no mere pleasure garden for the court's amusement, but a vast outdoor laboratory, a living extension of the Crucible's work, dedicated to the single, monumental task of remaking the nation's agriculture. Under the direction of the Sunstone botanist, a man now hailed as one of the kingdom's great heroes, a small army of gardeners, crucible alchemists, and seasoned farmers recruited from the shires most famed for their skill began a project of unprecedented scale and precision. The lumpy tubers, the potatoes, were not simply thrown into the ground. They were planted in dozens of carefully prepared plots, each with a different soil composition meticulously catalogued by the Great Survey: clay from the Midlands, loam from the south, sandy soil from the coast. The alchemists analyzed the effects of different manures, while the farmers experimented with planting depths and watering schedules, with every variable and every outcome recorded in precise, leather-bound ledgers. The same rigorous methodology was applied to the kernels of maize and to the precious quinaquina saplings, which were housed in magnificent glass and iron conservatories, great crystal palaces where the temperature and humidity could be controlled to mimic their native mountain climate. This was the birth of agricultural science, a deliberate and systematic effort to understand and optimize the very processes of life. Once the optimal methods of cultivation were established, Isabella initiated the second phase of her plan, the Great Propagation. This was not a command from the throne, but a national campaign of persuasion. A new army of agents, the Queen's Gardeners, was dispatched from Richmond. They were practical men, trained in the new techniques, and they traveled to every corner of the kingdom, armed not with swords, but with sacks of seed potatoes, detailed, wood-cut illustrated pamphlets from the royal presses explaining the methods of cultivation, and a powerful set of royal incentives. Any parish that converted a tenth of its common land to the new crops and met its production targets, as measured by the commissioners of the survey, would receive a 5-year remission of the crown tithe. The program was a masterclass in data-driven governance. The Queen's Gardeners were sent first to the regions the survey had identified as most vulnerable to crop failure and famine, where the promise of a hardy, high-yield alternative to wheat was not a novelty, but a matter of survival. The social and demographic impact was profound and swift. Within a generation, the potato, once a foreign curiosity, became a staple of the English diet, a cheap and abundant source of nutrition that insulated the population from the devastating effects of a failed grain harvest. The cycle of famine was broken. The population, healthier and better fed, began to grow, providing the demographic fuel for the continuing expansion of the nation's industries. The royal gardens at Richmond became a national spectacle, a symbol of this new, benevolent power. Foreign ambassadors were taken on tours of the immaculate experimental plots and the gleaming glasshouses, where they saw not a martial display of cannons and soldiers, but a demonstration of a far more fundamental strength, a kingdom that could feed its people, heal its sick with the queen's bark, the refined quinine now being produced in secret, and rationally manage its own sustenance. It was an empire not of plunder, but of plenty, a garden of earthly delights cultivated by the tools of reason, a quiet but undeniable declaration that the ultimate purpose of knowledge, in Isabella's England, was to build a world where no one had to starve. Part 15. The Unwritten Chapter. In the long, golden autumn of her reign, Queen Isabella, now past her 70th year, would often walk the stone terraces of Greenwich Palace, the place of her birth and the prime meridian of her remade world. From that vantage point, she could survey the physical and intellectual landscape she had meticulously crafted over half a century. The Thames below was no longer a sluggish, garbage-choked sewer, but a bustling, managed waterway, its banks lined with the stone quays of the Meridian Project, its waters thick with the traffic of a global trading empire. In the distance, the new brick and stone skyline of London rose, a city reborn from medieval chaos into a semblance of rational order. Her England was a marvel of the age. Its people were the best fed in Europe, their bellies full of the strange new crops from the royal gardens. Its cannons, forged in the controlled fires of the crucible, were the envy of every continental power. Its ships, navigating by the secret magnetic charts of Dr. D, sailed with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her parliament, unique assembly of land, commerce, and craft, legislated with an unprecedented grasp of the nation's intricate realities. She had built a kingdom on the bedrock of empirical knowledge, a magnificent, intricate machine of state whose gears meshed with astonishing precision. Yet, she knew that the machine had a fatal flaw, a single point of catastrophic failure: herself. She was the ghost in her own machine, the mortal mind that powered the entire enterprise. She had never married, never produced an heir, rejecting every suitor from every court in Europe. In her youth, it had been a political calculation, a way to play rival powers against each other. In her maturity, it had become a philosophical conviction. She had been married to her kingdom, and she would not share her authority with a consort or risk the stability of her project on the uncertain qualities of a son. But now, in the twilight of her life, this singular devotion had created the ultimate crisis of succession. The whispers that had followed her to her coronation had returned, now amplified by the impending reality of her death. The question of who would inherit her meticulously constructed world was the one variable she could not control, the one problem she could not solve with data and reason alone. Two powerful factions circled the throne, watching her every breath. On one side were the inheritors of the old order, the great landed families who had never truly accepted her revolution. They saw in her impending death a chance to turn back the clock, to restore a world governed by bloodline and divine sanction, not by surveyors and merchants. They quietly championed a distant Stuart cousin in Scotland, a man of impeccable royal lineage and traditional piety, as the natural and proper heir. On the other side were the children of her new England, the directors of the Company of Sea Dragons, the fellows of the Crucible, the guild representatives in her parliament. They were the new establishment, a meritocracy of talent and expertise, who owed their entire existence to her reign. The thought of a traditional monarch returning to power, a king who might dismiss the Great Survey as an expensive folly and the Crucible as a den of godless sorcerers, filled them with existential terror. They saw the future not as a matter of succession, but of survival. In her final years, Isabella embarked on her last and most audacious project. It was a project not of building, but of preservation. If she could not guarantee the quality of the next monarch, she would redesign the very nature of the monarchy itself. She summoned her parliament for one last great undertaking. She did not present them with an heir. She presented them with a document, the Great Charter of Governance. It was the culmination of her life's work, a written constitution that would formally codify the system she had built by instinct and improvisation. It was her attempt to make her revolution permanent, to transform her personal philosophy into the enduring law of the land. The charter's provisions were radical. It formally declared that the sovereign ruled not by divine right alone, but through a sacred covenant with Parliament. It made the Crown's right to tax and to make law conditional upon the consent of both the House of Lords and the expanded House of Commons. It established the Crucible and the Company of Sea Dragons as permanent, royally chartered institutions with their own protected endowments, shielding them from the whims of a future, less enlightened monarch. Its most revolutionary clause, however, concerned the succession itself. It decreed that upon the monarch's death, sovereignty would not pass immediately to a designated heir. Instead, it would be temporarily vested in a Council of the Realm, a body composed of the Lord Chancellor, the directors of the Crucible and the Company, and elected representatives from both Houses of Parliament. This council's sole task would be to select the next monarch from a pool of eligible candidates of royal blood, basing their choice not just on lineage, but on a formal assessment of their education, their health, and their sworn, unbreakable oath to uphold every article of the new Great Charter. The debate was the final, titanic struggle of her reign. The traditionalists saw it as the ultimate heresy, the final destruction of a sacred, God-given order, a committee of commoners presuming to choose God's anointed. But the new men, the majority she had so carefully cultivated, fought for it with the desperate ferocity of people fighting for their very existence. Isabella, frail but with her intellect burning as brightly as ever, attended every session, guiding the debate, countering arguments from tradition with irrefutable data on the stability and prosperity her system had brought. In the end, the charter passed. It was her final victory. A few months later, Queen Isabella died peacefully at Greenwich. Her passing was not followed by the chaos and civil war that had haunted the Tudor dynasty for a century. There was no pilgrimage of grace, no disputed claim. Instead, the great machine she had built continued to turn. The Council of the Realm convened. They deliberated for 2 weeks, following the procedures laid down in her charter. They chose her Scottish cousin, but only after he had traveled to London and, before the assembled Parliament, taken the solemn oath to govern according to the new laws. The Tudor queen who had changed everything was gone. She had left no child of her body to continue her line. She had left something far more rare and far more enduring, a system, an idea, a set of institutions designed to function without her. She had written the great body of her reign's history, but its final, ultimate success would be determined by the actions of those who came after her, in the pages of an unwritten chapter. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a different past. If Isabella's story teaches us anything, it is that the greatest empires are built not on gold, but on knowledge. The unwritten chapters of history are often the most fascinating. Don't forget to like and subscribe.